Welcome, David. Welcome, everyone. This seminar is run digitally, but as you see, David and I are at SCAS, but in different locations and on Zoom, so that makes for some multi-layered presence. Well, I have the great pleasure and honor to introduce David Ciepley, who will talk on the topic of constitutional democracy and the corporation, from Republican liberty to oligarchy. David Ciepley is an associate fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. And for this academic year, we are very happy and honored to have him as a fellow in residence here at the Swedish Collegium. He received his PhD in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago in 2001. And during his postdoc period, he served as assistant and then associate professor of political science at the University of Denver from 2007 to 2019. He has held a great variety of national and international fellowships, including, for example, at McGill University in Montreal as a Fulbright Scholar, at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. David publishes in the fields of democratic theory, liberal theory, and corporate theory. And he is the author of several highly interesting works, and I'm going to mention a few here. The book Liberalism in the Shadow of Totalitarianism, published by Harvard University in 2006. Now, in this book, very briefly, he argues that more than any other factor, it was the encounter with totalitarianism that dissolved the ideals of American progressivism and crystallized the ideals of post-war liberalism. David is also the author of the article Beyond Public and Private, Towards a Political Theory of the Corporation, published in the American Political Science Review in 2013. This article challenges the liberal contractual theory of the corporation and argues for replacing it with a political theory of the corporation. And a couple of other articles of his that I'd like to mention are Is the US Government a Corporation?, published in the American Political Science Review in 2017. And the more recent article, Can Corporations be held to the public interest or even to the law?, published in Journal of Business Ethics last year. Now, his current book project, Constitutional Democracy and the Corporation, explores whether a corporate economy is or can be made compatible with constitutional democracy. I believe it's fair to say that David, in his research and writings, challenges some of the established connections between the public and private, between the state and the corporation, between public and private interest in a very compelling way. So David, we're very pleased to have you here. And now the floor, so to speak, is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Christina, for that very thorough and generous introduction. It's an immense pleasure to be here, even in these crazy times, perhaps especially in these crazy times. So thank you to everyone for logging in. I'd like to think that my SCOS lecture is the most important thing happening in the world today. I'll settle for number 2. But in all seriousness, I didn't sleep at all last night because I'm so anxious about the outcome of this US election. That tends to mean my voice gets very weak quickly. So hopefully it will hold out. I have the bad habit of shouting at Zoom. I will try not to do that. But if you can't hear me, just please someone pipe up and let me know to speak a little more loudly. So normally when provided with a full 50-minute lecture slot, I present together my work on the corporate origins of the constitutional republic and on my work on business corporation to emphasize their common origin and twinned nature. But before taking up the story of their changing relationship over time. But last month at the launch of the Global Horizons Fellowship Program, I presented in brief compass some of my work on the corporate origins of the constitutional republic. and I don't want to repeat myself too much. So apologies to those who weren't there for that. Today, I'll only reference that story without elaborating on it. At the same time, some of the summary points I made about corporations last time, I will need to repeat for the sake of a coherent presentation today. So apologies also to those who were there last time for the repetition. But I think this is the most equitable way to proceed, as it will leave everyone equally dissatisfied with today's lecture. All right. So European civilization is a corporate civilization and has been for almost 1,000 years. The recovery of Justinian's Digest and the Roman law of corporations in the 11th century launched a legal rationalization and reorganization of civil society, church, and state along corporate lines. By the 13th century, a dense web of corporations, monasteries, cathedral chapters, confraternities, universities, market towns, and guilds had spread across the landscape of an energized Europe. I speak of corporations in the technical legal sense. They are legal entities that are granted the right by the sovereign or semi-sovereign who controls the court system to own property, make contracts, bear liabilities, and sue in court in their own names as so-called artificial persons, legally distinct from all natural persons, although acting through natural persons. As concisely put in Justinian's Digest, a debt to a corporation is not a debt to individuals, and a debt of a corporation is not a debt of individuals. That nicely illustrates the separateness of their property. So corporations are also granted the power of jurisdiction, literally law speaking, jurisdictio, the right of their members or officers to establish rules, bylaws, ordinances, work rules, and so forth, that are enforceable in court against those under its jurisdiction. This is the fact about corporations most overlooked today. Corporations are little governments. In fact, the Digest explicitly says that the corporation is modeled on the government, on the state. What is more, they are constitutional governments, receiving their jurisdictional authority via a government charter that erects, authorizes, and limits the corporation's government in written articles. This is the corporate constitution, the prototype of the modern state constitution. At root, the corporate form is not a business technology, but a governance technology. A corporate society is not libertarian, but highly governed. So using this governance technology, unknown or unavailable elsewhere, Europe's corporations filled, then overflowed the organizational niche occupied by clan networks in other civilizations after Christianity undermined clan ties in the West. This had profound consequences for the structure and trajectory of Europe and eventually the world. Not only did it create a new and powerful form of civil society, the medieval corporation also paved the way for the modern business corporation and gave a distinct form to other key European institutions, including church, empire, and state, which were for long themselves modeled as corporations. So last time I spoke in particular about how the modern constitutional republic was patterned after the early modern member corporation. The importance of this corporate history has been obscured in modern times by our liberal individualist self-description that attributes the West's modernity to the rise of individualism, religious, political, legal, and economic. There is truth to the story of in that there has been significant disembedding of individuals from prescriptive communities and hierarchies, but the story is one-sided. First, much of this disembedding occurred within these corporate bodies, especially within the medieval towns, the archetype for subsequent conceptions of liberal civil society, where the hierarchy of lord and serf was dissolved in a bath of equal membership. Second, it is not individuation, but organization that generates collective power. And looking at the key markers of Europe's rise, such as the growth of towns, universities, religious orders, trading companies, and the European state, we see not individualism per se, but individuals organized, usually under the corporate form. Ever since, the corporate form has been the West's preferred device for fostering and managing collective power. Today, the United States alone harbors literally millions of corporations, both nonprofit and for-profit, not to mention its corporate and quasi-corporate civil governments. The corporate form is the lead organizational device of the economy, civil society, church, and state. It is everywhere. Unfortunately, our canonical social theories fail to provide us with analytical categories or historical narratives adequate to our corporate world. Adam Smith, like his neoliberal lionizers, theorizes a world of small proprietors, individual producers and consumers interacting in markets. Marx theorizes a world of large proprietors with capital concentrated in ever fewer hands. Weber generalizes this. Separation of the worker from the means of production is paralleled by the separation of the soldier from the means of warfare, the separation of the official from the means of administration, the scientist from the means of research, and so on. Although to Weber, this leads not to revolution, but bureaucratization. But the important question that even Weber failed to ask is, who or what now holds title to all of this working property? What makes these separations possible at their present scale? The answer is juridical persons, either states or especially corporations. Marx was thus, by coincidence, right in his prediction that private property would become a fetter on the productive powers of capital, to be burst asunder and replaced by socialized property. But his error was that it has been socialized at the level of the corporation rather than at the level of the state. So when I mean a business corporation here, I know that's somewhat, doesn't fit perfectly with Swedish categories, but I believe I have the Swedish terms, the aktiebolag, and the börsnoterat företag, okay, are what we're talking about. The result is that today, almost all productive property, as well as all government property, church property, and most civil society property, is owned not by natural persons, but by abstract legal entities. We imagine that we continue to live in a private property economy, a bourgeois capitalist economy, in which the means of production are owned by natural persons, the capitalists. We do not. Ours is a corporate property economy in which legal entities are the owners. Put another way, a corporate firm is a special form of sole proprietorship in which the legal entity is the proprietor. The great debate that broke out in the mid-19th century between partisans of capitalism and socialism is to this day the framing dichotomy of political economy debate, and nowhere more persistently than in the US, where it set the terms of the Cold War and was even able to dominate the 2020 Democratic primary election. And yet it is precisely in the US that the terms of this debate were first and most thoroughly rendered obsolete due to the precocious corporatization of the US economy, significantly achieved already by the close of the 19th century. What do we call this new kind of economy? Is it corporate socialism? Because in parallel with state socialism, the productive property is owned by a legal entity rather than by natural persons. Is it corporate capitalism? Because it is still organized on the principle of private profit. Each captures something important, but leaves out something equally important. Maybe we call it for-profit corporate socialism. That is more accurate, but confusing. We as yet lack a vocabulary adequate to our economy, but desperately need one because words think for us. If for the time being we adopt the term corporate capitalism because the most familiar label, it must be borne in mind that it is a capitalism without the capitalist. The old owner-operator of the large enterprise has all but vanished. Legal entities are now the ones who own, the ones who contract, the ones who sue and are sued. They are the true principles of the corporate economy, while the humans that flock around them are but their legal agents and employees. This shift of ownership from natural persons to abstract legal entities has profound consequences. By dedicating property in perpetuity to specific activities, it vastly increases the achievable scale and time frame of joint human action, thus significantly augmenting collective power. From medieval cathedrals built over generations to modern multinationals spanning the globe, entity ownership makes things possible that would otherwise be impossible. It also creates the possibility of improved governance of these undertakings. Control is no longer determined by ownership, since the entity owns. Wealth thus loses its claim upon rule, allowing the expansion of leadership recruitment and the transformation of governance structures in a more constitutional direction. Entity ownership also alters lines of responsibility and liability, shifting liabilities from natural persons to the legal entities. It alters incentive structures, it alters economic classes, it alters societal dynamics. Yet it is woefully under-theorized or mis-theorized, largely due to our insistence on reducing all social life, including corporations themselves, to associating individuals. My book is intended as a corrective, developing the analytical categories, historical narratives, and normative frameworks needed to understand properly our corporate civilization, and then applying them to the current crisis of neoliberal political economy and constitutional democracy. So that is my project stated in programmatic terms. Today, I want to bring my framework to bear upon the corporate economy specifically, and in particular to the US and other Anglo-corporate economies, where both the intellectual confusions and economic dysfunctions are greatest. As an opening taste of the problems with the Anglo approach, please consider the following. Today in the US, the stockholders of publicly traded firms are overwhelmingly but rentiers, that is, passive outside investors, individuals with no experience working in the industry, who've likely never set foot in one of the company's facilities, and may be unaware even of what the company makes or does, paying attention only to their financial return from it. Many don't even know what stocks they own, owning them through their retirement accounts. Furthermore, stockholders bear no liability for the debts the company might accrue, the harms it might cause, or significantly, even for the crimes it might commit. Nor do they stay long. Today, on average, only 4 months. That's down from 6 years about 4 years ago. Nor do most stockholders ever make any direct financial contribution to the firm because they purchase their shares from existing stockholders on the stock market with not a penny going to the corporation. Nor do corporations on balance seem much to need these stockholders, as they have for years been buying back more stock than they've been issuing, gathering all the financing they need from earnings or the sale of bonds, that is debt. In short, of all the parties involved with the firm, the stockholders are the most ill-informed, irresponsible, uncommitted, and unnecessary. Yet, they're the ones entitled to elect the board, and the board, according to the reigning corporate governance ideal, is to attend solely to their financial returns over the well-being of workers, customers, the community, the environment, or even the long-term well-being of the company itself. This makes no sense. If you were starting with a blank slate today and knew what had become of the stockholder, you would never design it this way. It's an inheritance from an earlier age, but today it creates a host of problems and is proving itself to be incompatible with constitutional democracy, as I will explain. But on the reigning theory in the US and in many other places as well, there is little that can be or should be done about this because these stockholders are taken to be the corporation's owners. And it follows that management's job is to work for them, whether this is good or bad for everyone else. So here's the outline of my argument today. The business corporation is wrongly theorized today and has been for a long time. It is mistheorized both as to what it is and how it comes to be. And the theorization has frankly gotten worse over time as ever thicker layers of liberal and neoliberal ideology have been slathered on top of what is essentially a pre-modern, pre-liberal legal device. What is more, this misdescription of the corporation influences how corporations operate and how they are treated in law and politics. The consequences of this have been overwhelmingly negative for both the economy and for democracy, and these consequences too have been getting worse over time, to the point where constitutional democracy is threatened by them. In response, I will explain what is wrong with the received understanding of corporations and will excavate the historical root of this misunderstanding. I will also present what I believe is the correct way to understand them, for it's my contention that an accurate account of what a corporation is and how it comes to be opens up new possibilities for reforming corporate governance and better preserving constitutional democracy. So what is a business corporation? I've already laid out its bedrock features, which it shares with all other corporations. A corporation is a little government. Like a state, it is a legal entity distinct from all of the natural persons associated with it that owns and contracts in its own name. And it has jurisdictional authority, the authority to command and legislate. This is all quite clear to us when we take the private university as our example, as we did last time. We recognize that natural persons do not own its assets. A legal entity owns them. And we professors are all too aware that university officials do a lot of governing. And we are aware that they get their authority from the board. And it doesn't take much prompting for us to see that the board's authority comes from the state via the university's founding charter. But as soon as stockholders enter the picture, we become confused. And we hear it said that stockholders own the corporation and that they give the board its authority, just as if they were the partners of a partnership. I should clarify here that partners really do jointly own the property of the general partnership and are jointly and severally liable for it. That's the main difference. So this is, for example, the view promulgated by the famous free market economist Milton Friedman in a 1970 polemical piece that expressed the emerging Chicago neoliberal view. In a free enterprise private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. And by that, he of course means the stockholders. He has direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible. So Friedman is suggesting that the corporation is a kind of partnership with the stockholders as its partners. The stockholders jointly own the firm's assets and managers are their employees. Management's job, therefore, is to manage the stockholders' property and lower level employees on the stockholders' behalf and for their benefit, just as the management team would work for the partners if hired to manage a partnership. So Friedman's picture of the corporate firm is the dominant firm today. And here I've kind of diagrammed what it looks like. And you see in the green, the partners are there, the owners of the assets. And Friedman is thinking that the stockholders are there in the position of the partners, right? And the management works directly for them, as you see there. Okay, I'm going to give you now a better picture of what a corporation looks like. Okay, now you see it.
Perfect.
My apologies. Okay, so there's the partnership. This is Milton Friedman's version of the corporation, where the stockholders are in the position of the partners. Okay, they own the assets and management works directly for them. Okay, here's my diagram of what a corporation looks like. And you will see here now, there's a abstract legal entity in the position of the owner. So let me just run through some of these claims of Friedman and show why they are not correct. So stockholders do not own the assets of the corporation. They cannot use them, exclude others from them, lend them to others, borrow on them, or sell them. These are the rights of ownership, and they belong to the corporate entity and are exercised on its behalf by management. Stockholders not even have the right to the profits as residual claimants. The corporate entity is the residual claimant with dividends issued at the discretion of management. What stockholders own are shares of stock. That's just a financial instrument. Stockholding brings certain rights, but not ownership rights. The assets of a corporate firm are owned by the corporate entity, just as the assets of a university are. Again, it is capitalism without the capitalist. Secondly, the stockholders do not own the firm's assets has direct implications for the board's authority and the authority of the executives it hires. Friedman implies that the authority derives from the stockholder owners. But if the stockholders aren't the owners, this can't be right. If I refer back to a point I made last time, that in the modern era, there are only two sources for the right to rule. That is, there are only two ways in which one adult acquires the right to issue commands and rules that another adult has a legal duty to obey. One is through a labor contract, In the paradigmatic example, an owner of productive property who has the right to exclude others from this property can also give them access to it on condition that they sign an employment contract. And this contract brings with it a non-negotiable duty on the part of the employee to obey the employer within certain legal limits. The trouble for Friedman's view is that stockholders do not own the firm's property and cannot exclude others from it. There is therefore no inducement for others to sign a labor contract with them, and indeed, no one has a labor contract with them. Not the board members, not the executives, not the line workers. And no one has a legal duty to obey them. They have no legal authority over the property of the corporation or anyone who works for it. There is no circumstance in which they may manage the firm themselves. And here's the point: they cannot delegate to the board or to the executives an authority they do not have. Now, it is true that in the Anglo-American countries and many others, corporate law gives the stockholders the right to elect the board members, at least once the terms of the initial board members expire. Doesn't this prove that the stockholders authorize the board? Many are misled by this, but it just means that by statutory law, and not by virtue of any ownership claim, stockholders have the right to select the occupant of the office of director. It does not mean that the authority of the office itself derives from the stockholders. So whence comes this authority of the office? This takes us to the other source of the right to rule, which is sovereignty. Like the office of university trustee, the office of director is created by the state via the charter. The authority of the board derives not from ownership and not from the stockholders, but from state sovereignty. Indeed, in the US, the stockholders typically don't exist at the time the board is created and begins running the company. The board is authorized to issue a certain number of shares of stock, but these shares are typically not issued until later. The board creates the stockholders don't create the board. The board is thus not their employee or agent. The board has original jurisdiction over the corporation's property and personnel granted to it by the charter. There are a variety of reasons why we lose sight of the corporation's debt to the state, but one reason is inherent to the corporate form itself, which is that incorporation involves a most unusual way of delegating authority. And here I will repeat myself a bit from last time. The most common manner of delegating authority is from a principal to an agent, such as from a boss to an employee. The agent has a fiduciary duty to advance the interests of the principal, and the principal has ultimate control and can order the agent to do the job one way or another. The state's delegation of authority to a corporate board is very different. First, it does not delegate its authority to a specific person or set of persons, but to an office, the office of director, and then sets out the procedures for how that office is to be filled. Second, the state does not serve as the principal. Rather, the state designates the corporate entity as the principal, and the board serves as its agent with a fiduciary duty to it and to its purpose as declared in the charter. Right? So directors should be thought of as fiduciaries to the corporate purpose. Third, the state does not tell the board how to run things, but leaves it to its discretion. If the state doesn't like the way things are going, it reserves the right to amend or withdraw the charter, although this almost never happens today, but it used to a lot. Otherwise, the state only intervenes, usually through the courts, if the corporation departs from its authorized purpose or otherwise overleaps the bounds of its charter or violates the law. In other words, although the corporation is constitutionally dependent upon the state, it is operationally independent of it. It hires its own personnel, it secures its own financing, it manages its own affairs. Because of this, it is easy to imagine that there is no role played by the state at all. Its role is the constitutional one of creating the legal entity, mandating its governance structure, and delegating authority to it. The corporation is thus a public-private hybrid. It is not a creation of private contract or a private government. In the terminology I use, it is a franchise government. It is a little government, and it is a franchisee of the state with rights and privileges held of the state, but operating independently of it. Indeed, I now believe that we can put this more strongly, the corporation is not merely a creature of the state, it is, to use a term from the movie Blade Runner, a replicant of the state. The state extends to it the state's own legal form and jurisdictional authority to be utilized for purposes the state approves, under a form of government the state prescribes. It's the state's mini-me. And why does the state delegate authority to corporate bodies? Historically, the answer is clear. As put by Henry Carter Adams, an important late 19th century American economist, a corporation may be defined in the light of history as a body created by law for the purpose of attaining public ends through an appeal to private interests, end quote. Typically, this meant things that the state wanted done but didn't have the capacity or desire to do itself. For example, regulate an industry, a task it would delegate to a guild, or provide higher education, or build and manage infrastructure. So it would enlist private capital and private managerial capacity to these ends, and then giving it this privileged corporate form that augments collective power to let it do that. And it would do this by creating an inferior government, that is, a corporate government, authorized by and limited by charter to pursue this purpose, with the state exercising only negative supervision, usually lodged in the courts, to keep the corporation to the terms of its charter and the law of the land. Once we understand the true ontology of corporations, we see that they are an extension of the state's sovereignty, which in the final analysis is the people's sovereignty. I believe normative implications follow from this. First, given the debt of every corporation to the public authority for its very existence, it would be reasonable to expect corporations to serve the public interest, not just the pecuniary interests of their stockholders. Second, given that the board's authority over the employees comes from the public authority, it would be reasonable to expect corporate employees to have at least some of the rights and protections of public employees. Third, at least in the US, the national constitution requires the individual states to maintain a republican form of government, that is, a popularly accountable form of government. Why then are the American states, which do most of the corporate chartering, erecting and empowering corporate governments that are unaccountable and autocratic rather than republican to rule over their citizens during their working hours? This may not be technically unconstitutional, but it is certainly inconsistent with the republican principles that the states are supposed to uphold. Furthermore, once we understand the true ontology of the business corporation, we see that there's a huge opportunity being missed. Last time I talked about the corporate genesis of modern constitutionalism. A key reason for tracing the constitutional republic and the business corporation back to their common corporate root is to underscore their common nature. They use the same legal device for augmenting collective power. Namely, they dedicate property to a purpose in perpetuity by placing it in the hands of an undying legal entity. And both places property under the control of a constitutional, that is, chartered government. More, each receives its charter and governing authority from the same ultimate authorizer, historically the king, today the people or state. The important implication is that for both, the question, who should control it, cannot be decided by asking who owns it, because an entity owns the property, not natural persons. Wealth has no legitimate owner claim upon control in either. Instead, the sovereign authorizer sets their control structure. Each can thus hypothetically range from participatory democracy to constitutional dictatorship, to anything in between, depending on the terms of the charter. The choice among possible control structures should depend only on public policy criteria such as organizational effectiveness, non-domination of subordinates, equitable distribution of benefits, and minimization of negative externalities. This ought to refocus the current scholarly discussion of the economy. Currently, the focus is on the unequal ownership of property or capital. Think of Piketty's work, for example, or Katrina Pistor. But despite the importance of that, it is not the fundamental issue. The distribution of income in the economy is but a symptom of the distribution of control in the economy. Whoever controls the firm distributes its revenues. In the economy of Karl Marx's day, firms were proprietorships, so ownership brought control. It was therefore appropriate to focus on ownership. But in a corporate economy, control does not derive from true ownership. So one must focus on the issue of control directly, which has always been the fundamental issue. Das Kapital, focusing on property ownership, is an appropriate title for a book addressed to a 19th century economy. But control is the right title for a book addressing the 21st century economy. Although I don't know if that will be the title. I may throw up some titles at the end and take your opinion offline. The rise of a corporate economy, which liberates control from ownership, creates an enormous opportunity for the public authority to implement control structures that bend the economy towards the public good. The paradox is that while absolute monarchs overwhelmingly chartered republican corporations, modern republics, despite their republican corporate pedigree and their formal dedication to securing republican liberty, have overwhelmingly chartered authoritarian stockholder-dominated corporations. The reason is not that stockholder dominance is the most effective form of corporate governance. The Germanic and Nordic countries have disproven that. The reason goes back to the influential Anglo mythology that stockholders own it, which implies that all power and benefits should lie with them. Public authorities structure control as if stockholders are the owners or quasi-owners. And I would note that even Germany, which mandates the greatest worker representation in corporate control at 50% of the supervisory board, is still constrained by this mythology. The stockholders hold the other 50% and get to cast the tie-breaking vote. And this is because they're held to be the owners with a right to preponderant control. I now want to show where this mythology comes from. I believe critiques are always stronger if you can show why otherwise reasonable people got it wrong. So I began by going back through history to determine when and why the mistake was made of treating the stockholders as the owners. And finding it throughout the 19th century, I decided to jump to the beginning of the history, to the world's first significant stockholder-dominated corporation, the English East India Company, planning to work forward from there. And to my astonishment and perplexity, I found that from the very beginning, its stockholders thought of themselves as the owners. For example, the annual General Assembly of stockholders was called the Court of Proprietors. Now, a reasonable man would come to doubt their own theory, since founders are rarely so mistaken about what they're doing in their founding. But I'm a pig-headed man, and so I instead concluded that these hundreds of English merchants simply didn't know what they were talking about. But I'm nonetheless a charitable pighead, so I continued to believe that there must be some good reason that they were mistaken. And I recalled reading that at some point in the 17th century, the English East India Company reformed itself along the lines of the Dutch East India Company. And this led me to the hypothesis that the Dutch were the real founders of the modern business corporation, and that the English simply misunderstood and mislabeled what they were borrowing. And this is what I found to be true. So I want to turn now to the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, to observe the genesis of the modern business corporation, and then see what went wrong when the English copied it. In thinking about the origins of the business corporation, it's important to emphasize at the outset that the issue was not one of finding a profitable business form for long-distance trade to Asia. In the final decade of the 16th century, 6 merchant partnerships sprang up in different Dutch cities and plied a lucrative trade to the Indies. But the States General of the new Dutch Republic got the idea that if their trading fleets were put under common direction, they might double as an effective naval force that could attack Spanish and Portuguese interests in Asia, thereby relieving pressure on the Dutch homeland. The 6 merchant groups, in turn, thought that working together as part of a trade monopoly rather than in competition would boost profits further. And so the VOC was born. In other words, the birth of the business corporation is not an economist story about business efficiency centering on the logic of increasing returns to scale in a competitive market. It was imperial competition, not business competition, that produced it. The Dutch VOC, as chartered in 1602, was not any kind of corporation, although usually described as one. It was more like a legalized cartel of these 6 pre-companies, which continued as 6 operationally independent chambers within the VOC. The VOC had a governing board, the Heren 17, which gave general instructions to the company fleets and fixed the sale prices of their goods upon return. But the VOC lacked separate juridical personhood. Specifically, the merchant directors of each of its 6 chambers remained personally responsible for equipping their chamber's fleet and fully liable for all debts contracted. Outside investors could put money into one or another of these individual chambers, and there were 2 innovations involved in this. First, their investment will be locked into the chamber for a period of 10 years rather than only until the return of the fleet, and not returned to them until the company's first scheduled liquidation in 1612. Second, as compensation for this long lockup period, investors were allowed to sell their shares to any willing buyer, returning liquidity to them. This created the first corporate stock market. Over the first 2 decades of the company's operation, a number of changes occurred that had the effect of transforming it into a fully fledged property corporation. I'll just mention the 2 most important. First, the board, with the support of the Dutch States General, reneged on the planned liquidation out of fears, surely accurate, that doing so would deprive the company of its hard-won, indeed violently won, positions and fortifications in Asia. The investors' money would be locked in indefinitely, creating permanent capital for the company. This was an expropriation, pure and simple, and the investors howled in protest. These Dutch stockholders knew very well that they no longer had any share in the property of the corporation. What they now owned was just a financial instrument, but their pacification was secured with a 162.5% dividend. Second, it turned out that the scale necessary for efficient operation in Asia as a bellicose trader could not be achieved through share subscriptions or retained earnings, which were meager until such scale was reached. On top of these, it would take massive borrowing, which the chamber directors were unwilling to do while on the hook for the liability. In 1623, the Dutch courts provided the solution by allowing the VOC to issue bonds in its own name. This effectively turned the VOC into a separate property owning and contracting entity, a juridical person. This was a momentous development for the company, which thereupon rapidly took on debt, increased scale, and achieved a supremacy in the Asian trade never eclipsed until its dissolution in 1800. This was also a momentous development for the legal form of business. The VOC had, through these improvised institutional innovations, acquired all the attributes singled out by present-day legal scholars as defining of the modern business corporation: a permanent capital, legal personhood, separation of shareholder and management, limited liability for shareholders and directors, and tradable shares. It was arguably the first modern business corporation, although it continued to possess any number of early modern features as well. The English East India Company, or EIC, traveled down a very different path until it abandoned that path and copied the Dutch. Unlike the VOC, the EIC did begin as a corporation, but not as a unified business corporation. It was chartered as a so-called regulated company. A regulated company was a guild of merchants with a state-granted monopoly over a piece of overseas trade. Operating on the principle of one member, one vote, its members collectively set the rules for the trade and the rules for the use of the corporate property, such as common warehouses, doing so either directly at a members' meeting or through an elected board. But in principle, each merchant traded on his own capital. In this, it was a typical member corporation of the Republican type, with the members establishing a government over themselves as individuals. However, the costs involved in trade to the Indies were so great that from the very first, members of the EIC Guild, not all of them and not always the same ones, organized a succession of joint stock companies. These are a form of partnership to undertake trading expeditions, each company selling all of its assets with the return of its ships and dividing the proceeds, as was customary with merchant partnerships. Naturally, the participants in the early EIC saw themselves both as members and owners. They were the members of the guild, and they were co-owners of the joint stock partnerships in which they participated. The results of this arrangement, however, were not happy, with the separate joint stock enterprises undercutting one another in Asia and with merchants quarreling over the fair division of the returned goods. The superiority of the reformed VOC was not hard to see, with its accumulating permanent capital, permanent basis, and seemingly permanent dominance over the diminutive English joint stocks. The rechartering of the EIC in 1657 began the process whereby the EIC was enabled to compete with the VOC by adopting its form. From the very start, the EIC had juridical personhood, although only as a regulated company or guild. Starting in 1657, the trade was unified under one monopoly company, making it a unified business firm. All assets were locked into the company and titled to the corporate entity. Directors were exempted from liability for company debts. The merchants, formerly members and owners, became outside stockholders, also exempt from company debts. And their apprentices became company employees, the new insiders, but without membership status. This was all just like the VOC, or almost so. The erstwhile members of the guild who had elected the board continued to elect the new board in their role as stockholders. This made the EIC a stockholder-dominated enterprise, unlike the VOC, whose board members were appointed by the burgomeisters of the Dutch cities. There are 2 points to make about this. First, the evidence suggests that this was not a superior form of governance to that of the VOC. The familiar problem of the EIC is that the demand of its stockholders for large dividends at numerous points brought the company to the brink of financial collapse. The VOC was always larger than the EIC and retained its monopoly on the spice islands and spice trade, forcing the EIC to pioneer new markets in things such as Indian calicos and Chinese tea. Second, the stockholders' power of election didn't preserve the EIC as a Republican member corporation. What had been a Republican member corporation was now best described as an authoritarian property corporation, imperial in structure, in which one group, the stockholders, elects a government over another group, the employees, for the purpose of labor extraction. That's not a republic. Despite this dramatic transformation, it is of great import that the EIC stockholders did not change their legal terminology to reflect the change in corporate form, but continued to speak of themselves as the members and owners of the corporation, however inapt. And remember, the VOC stockholders did not think of themselves as members or owners. They had it right. So there isn't time to provide the full explanation today, but in brief, some parts of this, the membership notion was kept alive partly for the reason that the stockholders could still vote, even if no longer on the membership principle of one member, one vote. And the ownership notion was kept alive partly for the reason that they never experienced the same object lesson as the Dutch stockholders of a sudden expropriation. They voluntarily subscribed to the new company and for a while had a charter granted option once every 3 years to withdraw from the company and take a proportionate portion of the company's book value with them as an alternative to selling their stock. This helped carry forward the notion that the stockholders were the owners of a portion of the company's assets, even if their claim on these assets no longer derived from legal title, but was episodic and conditional, resting on a charter provision. Okay, so the takeaway point here, what drove the coalescence of the modern business corporation was not profit-making within a free market system, but war-making within an imperial system. The first use of the business corporation was as an instrument of imperial expansion. I'm not trying to argue with this that the business corporation is inherently imperialistic, but it does underscore that corporations are strongly governmental enough to acquire and manage an empire. Empire was the first undertaking in which for-profit business enterprises required massive amounts of dedicated, specialized capital on a scale that made the corporate form not only advantageous, but virtually indispensable. After that, banking. After that, infrastructure. After that, the Industrial Revolution. So what happens when these two corporate offshoots of England's corporate empire, the Constitutional Republic and the Business Corporation, try to cohabitate? Are they compatible? This was the single biggest question rocking American politics in its first decades, until the issue of slavery eclipsed it. And the question has never gone away. To understand this, it's helpful to bear in mind how much the valence of the corporation had changed. In the Middle Ages, if one was lucky, one could escape from one's feudal lord into an incorporated town, a republic-like member corporation, and after a year and a day, gain the freedom of the city. The city air makes one free. But now the US was itself a republic, a medieval town blown up to national scale. And the type of corporations being chartered within it were increasingly authoritarian incorporations of property rather than Republican member corporations. Corporations, as some insightfully noted at the time, had gone from being islands of Republican liberty within a sea of feudal servitude to islands of feudal servitude within a sea of Republican liberty, at least for those white and male. Also, since corporations normally were granted perpetual life, fears were expressed that over time, all productive property would be engrossed by them, leaving none for the average citizen. This completed the image of corporations, transformed from havens against the old feudalism to instruments of a new feudalism. To this, they added a worry about corruption by corporation. Americans' famous Boston Tea Party is misremembered. This wasn't a tax revolt so much as a corporate corruption revolt. It was East India Company tea that was being dumped into the harbor because the company had bribed its way into an exemption from the shipping tax that the American traders were subject to and therefore at a disadvantage. The criticism of corporations was thus threefold. Corporations violated Republican equality in that charters were grants of special privileges to the few. They violated Republican liberty because they put people back under the arbitrary authority of individuals they did not elect. And they undermined Republican virtue because of the corrupting influence of concentrated wealth. It would be hard to deny that on each point, the early Americans were prescient. But the American legislatures found themselves in roughly the same unenviable position as the English crown of the 17th century. Big ambitions for building the physical and financial infrastructure necessary for rapid improvement, but having little public revenue or state capacity. So despite their own misgivings, they too turned to incorporation as a way to mobilize private capital and capacity, and they did so to an unprecedented degree, creating the first modern corporate economy. Today, all I can say about the 19th century trajectory of corporations is this. It began with the effort to republicanize the corporation, and it ended with efforts to liberalize the corporation. And by the latter, I mean the effort of corporate lawyers and other apologists to render the corporation palatable, not by reforming it, but simply by redescribing it as consistent with accepted liberal principles of private property and freedom of contract. And this was done by drawing on the mythology of stockholder ownership to characterize corporations as private partnerships of stockholders. I only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to skip the slide here, but it's just some quotes showing this. In the first half of the 20th century, progressives pushed back, but in the final decades of the century, Chicago neoliberals such as Milton Friedman and Michael Jensen successfully reasserted the contractarian view of the corporation. Treating the corporation as a private partnership of stockholder owners conceals the corporation's state dependence, but the costs are high.
I'm going to list a few. First, it is demonstrably wrong, as we have seen. Second, it normalizes the corporate form of business, unleashing corporations to pursue any money-making activity, regardless of whether it has a clear public benefit, and despite the moral hazard raised by its controllers being exempt from liability. Third, in declaring corporations to be fully private, it justifies freeing them from any duty to the public or accountability to the public or even transparency to the public. Fourth, affirming the stockholders as owners and members underwrites the doctrine of shareholder primacy. This pushes management to serve current, usually short-term stockholders above all else, to the detriment of other stakeholders and even the stockholders themselves in the long run. This is the key both to the deceleration of US growth and to its skyrocketing inequality compared to other OECD countries. Earnings that used to be shared with workers or reinvested in plant expansion, research and development, and worker training are disgorged to stockholders, that's the term they use, including executives who are now paid over 80% in stock as a bribe to refocus them on enriching stockholders alone. What is more, competitive strategy necessarily shifts from a high R&D, high skill, high quality, high wage path, you call that maybe the German path, it used to also be common in the US, to a low R&D, low skill, low quality, low wage path. And this path leads employers overseas, further suppressing domestic wages. The corporate multinational then finds it can leverage the mobility of capital to force a race to the bottom among countries in all areas: wage rates, labor protections, environmental regulations, and corporate tax rates. In sum, the corporation is transformed by neoliberalism, becomes an inequality machine, creating a slow growth, high exploitation, high inequality economy ministered to by a tax-starved ambulance state. Fifth, the reduction of corporations to private associations of owner members underwrites extending constitutional rights to corporations, including the right to spend unlimited amounts in political campaigns. Contrary to popular opinion, this is not done on the ground that corporations are themselves persons, but on the ground, equally mistaken, that they are mere associations of persons, associations of citizen stockholders, and that it is the constitutional rights of these citizens that are being protected. But this is bogus. Stockholders as citizens already enjoy the full protection of the Constitution. They can already spend as much as they want on electioneering, for example. Instead, constitutional protection is being given to abstract legal entities, protection against regulation by the governments that created them. This loosens the grip of the republic on its corporations while strengthening the grip of the corporations on the republic. Okay, final one, sixth. It abets the disenfranchising, de-skilling, and downgrading of corporate workers. Partly this is a corollary of the primacy given to stockholders, but it is also the result of treating corporations as purely private affairs. So, for example, constitutional rights extended to the corporation are denied to its workers because the workplace is regarded as the private property of the stockholders rather than as a state-derived jurisdiction. For the same reason, workers are denied any participation rights in company management. Corporate management is thus free to dominate workers with new surveillance technologies, speed-ups, arbitrary dismissals, etc. A domination that neoliberals studiously obscure by presenting inter-firm authority relations as wholly the result of freedom of contract in a way that conflates labor contracts, which contain a duty to obey, with commercial contracts, which do not. So I'll end on this note that this is the great paradox of the modern constitutional republic. Though born of the quest for Republican liberty, it nonetheless charters in unprecedented numbers imperial governments in its midst, which are accountable neither to their workers over whom they exercise direct authority, nor to the general public that suffers their activity, be it beneficial or harmful. So I did have a couple alternatives I was going to mention. The Germanic and Nordic countries deserve a shout out because of their co-determination, works councils, other forms of worker participation and management, which are in the direction of republicanizing the corporation. There's something on the Dutch nonprofit foundation-owned corporations that is also extremely interesting. But I will leave it there and just very happily take your questions and comments.